I'll take those. Those are for.
Okay, we're going to get started. All right, it's 12 o'clock. I'll call this meeting in order. Can we get a roll call, please?
Yes, Chair. Mike Labar,
Present?
Matt Simus,
Here.
Mark Gonzalez,
Here.
Deirdre Sullivan, Ken Eklund,
Here.
Mike Scatini, Jason Smith, John Bailey,
Here.
Marvin Borzini.
Here.
All right, at this time, is there any members of the public who could speak on any of the closed session items?
No hands raised.
All right, hearing and seeing none, we'll now go into closed session and return about 1 o'clock. Thank you.
Hey,
we're good. Whenever you're ready.
Whenever you are, Chair.
All right, it's 1:07. We'll call this meeting back to order. Agency counsel, was there any reportable actions from closed session?
No reportable items, and just for the record, Director Scattini joined us at the beginning of closed session.
Thank you. All right, Director Scattini, will you lead us in a Pledge of Allegiance? Thank you, Mike. All right, at this time, we have any additions or corrections?
At this time, Chair, I would like to add that we have received a general public comment from Bill Leip, and all Board of Directors have been given a copy of that.
Thank you. And then fellow directors, on the back of the agenda for item number 14, which was a supplemental, that will be taken as item 2A. So it'll be the second presentation. Any issues with that? All right. All right, now at this time, we'll open public comment for any members of the public to speak on any item that is not on the agenda. Again, I'll ask, is there any members of the public who would like to speak on any item not on the agenda?
No hands raised.
Thank you. Hearing and seeing none, we'll move on to presentations. Our first one is a presentation on the Deep Aquifers Study. This will be Amy.
Yes, good afternoon, Chair LeBar and directors. This is Amy Woodrow. I'm going to provide just a brief introduction to this item today. I am pleased to have this presentation be coming to the board. The agency was a collaborative funding partner on this Deep Aquifers study, and staff participated also on the Groundwater Technical Advisory Committee, which provided updates and input along the way throughout the study. This has been underway for the last couple of years, so it's really exciting to be able to share this with you today. We also have in chambers with you today is Sarah Hardgrave from the Salinas Valley Basin GSA, and the presentation today will be shared with you by Victoria Hermosia with Montgomery and Associates. I will hand things over to Sarah for a couple of words, and then we can go ahead and get started. Thank you.
My name is Sarah Hardgrave. I'm Deputy General Manager with the Salinas Valley Basin Groundwater Sustainability Agency, and we are pleased to be providing this presentation to you today with our respective consultant, Montgomery and Associates. Just a couple things to mention that in 2021, funding was secured from partners to fund this study, including Alco Water, California Water Service, Castroville Community Services District, City of Salinas, Marina Coast Water District Groundwater Sustainability Agency, the County of Monterey, Salinas Valley Basin GSA, and your agency. And you all were the largest proportional funding contributor to the study. We worked together to conduct a competitive request for proposals, and Montgomery and Associates was selected to complete the study starting in January 2022. It was expected to take about 2 years. As Amy mentioned, the Groundwater Technical Advisory Committee provided input throughout the study development, and we provided a little bit of extra time to them to conduct a review of the administrative draft before we published it this spring. The study incorporates their input along the way and on the final admin draft. This is a study that was called for by your agency in the county, as well as in the 180-400 foot aquifer subbasin and Monterey subbasin groundwater sustainability plans. Both of the groundwater sustainability plans include a management action to undertake and operationalize the guidance from this study. and it provides information that was needed to fill several data gaps that were required for Sustainable Groundwater Management Act compliance. Today's presentation is on the study itself, and I'd like to hand this presentation over to Victoria from Montgomery and Associates. But before they begin, I would like to acknowledge and thank Martin Feeney and Joe Oliver for being the senior reviewers of the study. And also we have Derek Williams with us here in Chambers to answer any questions. I have a couple of things I'll add at the end of the presentation, but Victoria, I'll turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Well, as Sarah said, my name is Victoria Hermosillo with Montgomery and Associates, and this was a wonderful study to conduct, and we'll just get right into it for the Deep Aquifer study. There we go. So we'll start with what are the deep aquifers within the Salinas Valley Basin. They are a key municipal and agricultural source of water, and they are particularly important within the seawater intruded areas. The image that we have shown on the screen here is a conceptualized model of the basin, and it shows not only the surface and where the coastline is, but also our principal aquifers in the subsurface, the 180-foot aquifer and then the 400-foot aquifer, both of which have recorded seawater intrusion, and then below the 400-foot aquifer, the deep aquifers. Each of these aquifers is separated by a respective aquitard, and the majority of the deep aquifers production and wells are primarily encountered in the areas where the shallower aquifers have been intruded by seawater. So this study, as Sarah mentioned, was necessary to understand the full extent of the deep aquifers. Before we get into some of the details, I want to start with some of the contributions of this study. The study developed a definition, an extent, and hydrogeologic conceptual model of the deep aquifers in its entirety. This study developed a water budget for the deep aquifers. The study made monitoring recommendations, and the study provided guidance for management based on the scientific findings that we will discuss in further slides. So before the study began, as Sarah mentioned, there was a need for a study to better understand the deep aquifers for management. I have two charts shown on the screen here. The chart on the left shows the deep aquifers extraction and the number of wells being installed over time, starting from the mid-90s and all the way up through 2023. The chart on the right-hand side is the cumulative change in water levels over time with the respective water year. Both of these charts also show when CSIP came online. But the main takeaway from this slide is that as time moves forward, more wells are being increased, more wells are being installed in the deep aquifers, more wells are pulling water out of the deep aquifers, and as more water is being pulled out of the deep aquifers, the water levels within the deep aquifers are declining over time, respectively. And this started the need for the study. Even when CSIP came online, there was a little bit of rebound in the cumulative water levels, but more and more wells being installed still results in more water, the water levels going down more and more over time. So as groundwater elevations have declined, wells and extraction have increased and vice versa. So the study focused on some key questions for management, starting with how should the deep aquifers be defined? What is the lateral extent of the deep aquifers? Does it receive inflows? What is the water budget? How should monitoring be focused? And what principles should guide management? Each of these questions builds on the last question, all the way up to what should the management be over time. And we'll start with what the definition is. Before we get into the definition, this study did add a lot more data to our database, a lot more understanding from data. We partnered with Ramboll to collect more geophysical data throughout the basin, targeting the deep aquifers specifically. They were wonderful partners, strong contributors to this study, and we explored different types of geophysical methods, but we did settle on AEM data, and we will go over that in a future slide. The study also conducted 2 aquifer tests to provide data on groundwater movement and storage within the subsurface. We partnered with Water Resource Agency to focus on groundwater chemistry, trying to assess the variation across the extent of the deep aquifers and any relationships they might have with overlying aquifers or adjacent aquifers. And then finally, the study did collect water samples for isotope analysis, trying to better understand the age of the water and, again, establishing a relationship with overlying aquifers or adjacent aquifers. So we'll get into these findings, starting with the definition. So the study did develop a scientifically robust definition of the deep aquifers. There is a flow chart on the right, but I won't read all of that. What I would really like to say is that the deep aquifers, as defined by the study, are the water-bearing sediments present below the 400-foot aquifer or its stratigraphic equivalent. Now, the definition does primarily focus on the presence of an aquitard or a body of higher clay content within the subsurface that separates the aquifer above from the aquifers below. We do need to have this separating body. The definition includes things like depth and geologic formation, since we do know that the deep aquifers are deep. They're deeper than the 180-foot aquifer and the 400-foot aquifer, and there are specific geologic formations that help comprise the deep aquifers. But the main focus of this definition is around the presence of an aquitard that separates it from the 400-foot aquifer or its equivalent above. Through this study, the geographic extent or the geographic understanding of the deep aquifers was expanded. The map on the left shows all of the Water Resource Agency designated deep aquifers wells. And those are the blue dots shown on the map on the left. And this shows a smaller extent of where the deep aquifers are. And of course, this is also primarily focused on where the majority of the production is occurring from the deep aquifers. But this was sort of an initial understanding of the deep aquifers. Through the study, the extent was expanded to the figure that you see on the right. The deep aquifers extent is defined as that solid yellow body on the map here with some uncertain extents in the hatched yellow areas just outside of it. But this extent was determined by looking at a variety of data, looking at the geologic formations, looking at structural features in the highlands areas, looking at where the Rayleigh Fault has offset different sediments, looking at the presence of the aquitard from AEM data or deep wells, really delineating this extent from other depositional environments along the east side in particular, and places where we could find or confirm the presence of the aquitard through the data available. So the study provided this new expanded extent here, along with a few areas where the deep aquifers may or may not be, but data do not yet confirm its presence. But we'll talk about these on certain extents in a later slide. As I mentioned earlier, the study did use AEM data to help map the presence of the aquitard in the subsurface. This is a slide that has a lot of information on it. We'll start with the map on the upper right-hand corner. This is a map of the Salinas Valley Basin with all of the AEM flight lines that have been flown since DWR Survey Area 1, where the state has been flying its own AEM surveys, collecting data in the subsurface and providing this data in a public forum. The study filled in a lot of the gaps between those lines, and this flight line in particular is highlighted in red. This flight line is then shown in the section that's the main part of the screen here, and this rainbow color shows the resistivity data in the subsurface. And the resistivity data is really just a reflection of how easily electricity can be transmitted in the subsurface. And the easier it is for electricity to be transmitted in the subsurface, the lower that material resists electrical conductivity. Those are going to be the cooler colors, the blues and the green hues, and those are very representative of clays in the subsurface. So when you see a figure like this, just try to think that the blues mean clay or high fine content. And then as the resistivity gets higher or more difficult for electrical conductivity to travel through the subsurface, we get into the hotter colors, the oranges and the reds, and then those hot purples. And just think of these colors really as a presence of high sand or gravel content. But this figure also includes some of that hot purple on the left, which is pretty indicative of bedrock contact. So very, very difficult for electrical conductivity to go through that material. And the main thing I want to point out on this slide, where we've circled in red, this is where we have identified through this data the presence of the 400 deep aquitard, that aquitard that separates the 400-foot aquifer from the deep aquifers. Also highlighted on this cross-section on this slide is the presence of the alluvial fans that are coming off Gavilan Range, and those are circled here in the black dashed lines. This was something that was very important through the course of the study to delineate where the clays of the alluvial fans were and how they were separate from the clays that separate the deep aquifers from the overlying aquifers. The study focused a lot on the geologic formations in the subsurface. This is a map, or this is a cross-section from a previous study from 2003, Feeney Rosenberg Tech Memo on the deep aquifers. This cross-section is right along the coastline and primarily focuses on the geologic formation, the Paso Robles Formation, the Purisima Formation, Santa Margarita Formation, and highlighted in red is where we generally encounter the deep aquifers in the subsurface. And it's important to note here that as the geology changes and shifts and is deformed, is uplifted on the right, the deep aquifers corresponding also is uplifted and deformed along with these geologic formations. And that has contributed to the extent, or the way the study delineated the extent in the subsurface. So through the course of the study, we wanted to focus on if they received any recharge, any natural surficial recharge. And through all of the data that were collected and analyzed, there is no evidence of modern recharge effectively. The study found no relationship between that natural surficial recharge and where the deep aquifers waters are in the subsurface. And I would like to delineate here, not that there's no movement of water in the subsurface at depth. We know that there could be vertical inflows and outflows across the aquitard, which through the study is primarily an area of higher clay content in the subsurface that acts in concert as an aquitard. So water can or has the potential to flow across that aquitard vertically. There are outcrops of those geologic formations, the Paso Robles Formation or the Santa Margarita Formation, that are far away from where the deep aquifers are primarily being produced. And those formations can either be intercepted by pumping or they're too far away. They're very, very far away from the main centers of pumping. And then there's also, because the extent of the deep aquifers does not completely cover the whole width of the basin, there are adjacent sediments right next to the extent of the deep aquifers where they have been defined, and there could be subsurface inflows and outflows from those adjacent aquifers, from those adjacent sediments. So this is a dynamic system. Aquifers are dynamic systems. Water can be flowing in and out. But what we really want to say here through the study is that there was no evidence of modern recharge reaching the deep aquifers. The study also identified 3 primary regions within the deep aquifers, shown on this map here. There's the northern region, there's the seaside region, and then there's the southeastern region. And these regions are not specifically focused on subbasins within the Salinas Valley Basin. Rather, they're more focused on what the data are showing within the extent of the deep aquifers. And you'll notice in particular, the seaside region is not the entire seaside basin. Rather, it's an area that is somewhat defined as spanning that boundary, and it has its own unique character, as does the northern region, as does the southeastern region. The northern region is defined a little bit more by the presence of the Paso Robles and Purisima formations and its own groundwater production and groundwater levels. There is a bit of a groundwater level divide. We get into the seaside region, which is primarily defined with the Santa Margarita Sandstone and the Paso Robles Formation. And then in the southeastern region, this is a unique region because there is a lack of true deep aquifers wells. And what we mean by that is that the wells that are drilled into the deep aquifers in this region, they are not exclusively screened underneath that aquitard or exclusively screened within the deep aquifers. Rather, these wells have screens that span from the 400-foot aquifer through the aquitard and into the deep aquifers a bit. So they're drawing water from more than one aquifer location in the subsurface. So they're not a true deep aquifer as well. So, and there's also far less data in the southeastern region as well. But these are the three primary regions defined within the deep aquifer study. Now, from these regions and with the best tools available, the study did model the deep aquifer subsurface inflows and outflows to get at a water budget. So to remind everyone, groundwater flows, of course, from the areas toward the areas of lowest groundwater levels. The map on the right shows the extent of the deep aquifers, those regions that we defined before, and the yellow arrows here are showing the areas, the regions that the groundwater is flowing either into the deep aquifers or out of the deep aquifers. And again, not as a representation of recharge, but more as a representation of the relationship with adjacent sediments across where that boundary has been defined. And then the figure on the left on this slide here is really a conceptualization of how this water budget and how these inflows and outflows are defined, all of the inputs and all of the inputs that go into the system where we're trying to delineate injection, pumping, subsurface exchange, and flows across that boundary. So getting a little bit more specifically into the water budget of the deep aquifers, we'll start with the northern region here. And the chart here on the right shows a lot of information. We have net flows, inflows, and outflows as the bars. And then in the lines on the chart, there's the cumulative change in storage in black. And then the purple line is the annual change in storage. And the main takeaway on this screen here is that over time, the outflows or the groundwater pumping or outflows along the boundary there shown in the red and yellow bars, those are growing in size with time. And then the inflows also growing a little bit, but less so. And the take-home message is that the cumulative change in storage is decreasing over time as more water is being pulled out of the deep aquifers. And this is in the northern region here. This is, of course, the region that has the most groundwater production within the deep aquifers. Within the seaside region, this tells a slightly different story. The extraction or the groundwater pumping and the leakage is slightly increasing over time, but the unique thing about the seaside region is that there is an injection program, there is an aquifer storage and recovery program within the seaside basin itself, and that definitely changes the balance of the water budget. But even though the magnitude of pumping is not the same as within the northern region, if you look at the cumulative change in storage, that black line, it is still going down with time. There is still more water leaving the deep aquifers within this region than there is coming in. We do have another chart like this for the southeastern region that is included in the report. It's just not included in the presentation today. But I did want to say we did make a chart for that, but there are fewer data that went into that. And this is just the table representation of the simulated water budget. And overall, it shows a decrease in storage in the deep aquifers. So again, this table shows a lot of what we just showed in the previous slides, where we have pumping, injection, a decrease in storage, subsurface flows, and other flows from other regions. The columns are broken out by the seaside region, the northern region. We do have values for the southeastern region, and of course, within the full deep aquifers extent, what these values are. And these values were developed with the best tools available, as I mentioned before, which are the seawater intrusion model, which is based on the Salinas Valley Integrated Hydrogeologic Model. We looked at a variety of tools to develop the water budget, and the seawater intrusion model came out ahead of all of the other tools that were available to develop this initial groundwater budget for the deep aquifers. So as shown here in the table, there is a lot more extraction occurring from the deep aquifers than there are inflows. And this is resulting in a decrease in storage of about 9,600 acre feet per year. this extraction is from reported values. This is a map that shows where those reported extraction numbers are coming from, and the chart on the left shows just the amount of extraction occurring. And again, this is all from reported data. The blue bars on the chart show the true deep aquifers wells. The kind of black gray bars are those wells that are screened between the 400-foot and deep aquifers, and the green bars are those seaside deep aquifers wells. And the map on the right shows the location of these wells that are reporting extraction, their character, whether they're urban or agriculture, and of course, the amount of extraction by the size of the bubble where that well is. And so this image very clearly shows there's a higher concentration of pumping within the northern region, and just sort of the distribution of how that pumping is occurring. Just another way to look at the water budget and look at the relationship between extraction and groundwater levels. These are charts that are relating those groundwater levels with extraction, again, by the northern region, the seaside region, and the southeastern region. And the overall take-home message from this slide is that extraction from the deep aquifers is estimated between 13,800 acre-feet per year and 17,700 acre-feet per year, and groundwater elevations are declining. So as we move forward in time, that the blue line on the screen here is going down with time as extraction is increasing. And that extraction is shown by the larger size of these bars on this chart. The special note I want to make about the seaside region, we did mention it before, and that is that there is injection into the deep aquifers, and this is why the water budget is a little bit different for that seaside region. There is water being injected into the Santa Margarita Formation and extracted, and that does impact the water budget within that basin itself. So that does make up a little bit of the difference, but only in that very, very specific region. Now, one of the other purposes of the deep aquifer study was to look at the risks to the deep aquifers. And one of the biggest risks, one of the biggest concerns for the deep aquifers is the risk for seawater intrusion. Within the Salinas Valley Basin, there is already a history of vertical transmission of seawater from a shallower aquifer to a deeper aquifer, and that's that relationship between the 180-foot aquifer and the 400-foot aquifer. So we wanted to look and see if there was this relationship for the deep aquifers as well. This is a slide, this is a chart, or sorry, a map that shows a vertical gradient within the deep aquifers and the 400-foot aquifer. So looking at the difference between groundwater levels in the 400-foot aquifer and the deep aquifers. And the main message here is that there is a downward vertical gradient, meaning that the groundwater levels within the deep aquifers are lower than the groundwater levels within the 400-foot aquifer. So groundwater, if it wanted to flow to that area of lower groundwater levels, would preferentially flow downward if there were a pathway. Now, there is an aquitard that does separate the 400-foot aquifer from the deep aquifers, but we also have this vertical gradient. The vertical gradient does not imply flow, but it does imply that if there's a pathway available, this would be the direction that groundwater would flow, and it is mostly downwards. This is a map of the latest seawater intrusion within the Salinas Valley Basin. And shown here is the historical extent of the 500 milligram per liter chloride isocontour. Also shown in that bright green line is the 250 milligram per liter chloride isocontour. And this is, again, to go along with that vertical gradient slide and demonstrate that, one, within the 400-foot aquifer, we have these islands in front of the leading edge of the seawater intrusion front, where vertical transmission of seawater from the 180-foot aquifer flowed downward and started to impact the 400-foot aquifer below. So again, looking at that vertical gradient between the 400-foot aquifer and now the deep aquifers was very important to assess the risk to the deep aquifers. The other risk that the study looked at was the risk for land subsidence. Now, this is an image on the left that sort of shows how land subsidence occurs as it relates to groundwater extraction. So the main thing to look at this image here is that there are the presence of clays and silts within the subsurface. These are acting as our aquatards. And as water is pulled from the subsurface, as water is extracted, what it's really doing in the subsurface is it is depressurizing the subsurface. There's a lot of water pressure within these sediments as they were deposited over time. But as we depressurize them from extraction, water starts to exit the clays and the silts, and they begin to compact. So we go from sort of a mixed clay in the subsurface, and all of those clay particles start to stack up and get compressed more. And as these clays compact over time, that starts to transmit all the way to the surface, and the ground begins to collapse. Now, the study did not determine whether or when subsidence will occur. It's very difficult to determine when subsidence may occur until it actually occurs. But this was another risk identified through the Deep Aquifer study. So this is a summary of current conditions. The analysis of historical and current conditions does not change the conceptual understanding of the deep aquifers. The current conditions assessed through the Deep Aquifer study confirm previous conclusions that the deep aquifers are in overdraft and not being recharged with modern water, and that they are at risk for seawater intrusion. Continued overdraft put the deep aquifers at risk for irreversible damage, and the data are sufficient for moving forward with management. So we'll talk about the guidance for management that the study determined. Starting with the regulatory context, there is already a regulatory context within the Salinas Valley Basin. The Seaside Subbasin is adjudicated. Other subbasins within the Salinas Valley Basin are subject to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, and management of any of the principal aquifers must meet adjudication or SGMA regulatory goals. And there is already existing agency authority within the Salinas Valley Basin as well. The study found there is sufficient jurisdictional and legal authority to manage the deep aquifers, both with the Water Resource Agency, Environmental Health, Marine Coast Water District, Salinas Valley Basin GSA, the Seaside Water Master, the cities, and the county. The study recommends that agencies should work collaboratively to manage across the extent of the deep aquifers and adjacent aquifers. And if you recall from the maps of the extent of the deep aquifers does not respect those jurisdictional boundaries. Those came much later than the sediments. So where the deep aquifers are present, the agencies should collaborate across those boundaries. There are a couple of types of management actions and projects. These are the large umbrella concepts of management actions, and specific projects can fall under one of these categories. One of the types of management actions is to decrease pumping, either by demand management or finding an alternative supply. The other type of management action is to increase recharge through injection, right? So we're decreasing the amount that is coming out of the aquifers and trying to increase the amount that is going back in. And these are just the larger umbrella management actions. Now, the study determined that the location of management should determine what kind of management is present. The study recommends to differentiate groundwater management by these three regions, as mentioned before. In the southeastern region in particular, since there is a lack of true deep aquifers wells, the study recommends to monitor this region first. Then, if the deep aquifers groundwater elevations are found to be declining, begin to manage the southeastern region. And of course, the study does recommend to manage together with adjacent and overlying aquifers, including wells at similar depths just outside of the extent. Now, it's not shown on this map here, but there are several wells within the Eastside Subbasin that are drilled at that deep aquifer's depth, but because they are in a different region, a different zone with the sediments, they are not within that deep aquifer's extent, but they are adjacent, and those should be managed collaboratively with the deep aquifers. As mentioned much earlier in this presentation, there are these areas of uncertainty, and those are circled here in red and shown with the yellow hatch mark. These are areas where there were data to suggest that the deep aquifers may extend this far, but there was not enough data to conclusively determine that the deep aquifers were were there. And so the study recommends to take a precautionary approach to new deep wells and increasing net extraction unless these are shown to not be deep aquifers. But regardless, these areas should be included in that adjacent management scheme anyways. So those are those uncertain regions. Now, the study does note again that current net extraction is not sustainable. So the study recommends to prevent increases in net extraction from new wells and to reduce overall net extraction. And these are those charts again to show the northern region and seaside region extraction and declining groundwater levels. The study did focus on hydrogeologic principles to guide management to prevent the risks identified within the study. This slide is to talk about preventing subsidence. The study recommends to keep the deep aquifers groundwater elevations above historical levels at a minimum, and that is to keep that pressure within the deep aquifers more in a positive pressure zone and pushing up against the sediments. Now, the hydrogeologic principle to guide management to prevent seawater intrusion is very similar to land subsidence. But because there are different pathways for seawater intrusion to occur, there are different hydrogeologic principles to approach each of these pathways. So if there is evidence of seawater intrusion leakage downward, then destroy any wells that may facilitate that leakage. So this image shows that vertical pathway or that vertical gradient and pathway contributing to the downward flow of intruded seawater. If there's a well that has facilitated that, of course, destroy that well. And there is historical precedent for that from the shallower aquifers. The other mitigation method is to raise groundwater levels to above the overlying aquifer groundwater levels where seawater intrusion is present. So again, to try to change that vertical gradient from being a downward vertical gradient and instead allow it to be an upward vertical gradient where the groundwater levels in the deep aquifers are higher than the groundwater levels within the 400-foot aquifer. And that helps create another physical mitigation method to keep seawater intrusion from flowing downward. Now, there's also from the Monterey Bay pathway for seawater intrusion. The study recommends to evaluate and select a preferred option for controlling lateral seawater intrusion from the ocean, but to only implement it if seawater intrusion is detected. So if that lateral seawater intrusion from the ocean becomes apparent through data, stop extraction in the vicinity of that intrusion and then implement that preferred action as quickly as possible. So the process to manage here, the study recommends to use simulated, sustainable, or safe yield by area to guide initial groundwater management. Again, the deep aquifers do span both the seaside adjudicated basin and then the Sigma subbasins. So depending on which goal and which management action is there to work with that. The study recommends to adjust management over time according to changes observed in groundwater elevations. The study recommends to include wells screened fully and partially within the deep aquifers, and then of course to manage together with those overlying aquifers and adjacent aquifers. The study recommends also to adaptively manage the deep aquifers such that the quantity of extraction and injection is reviewed and revised periodically based on groundwater elevations. So this is just a little chart that kind of shows that adaptive management approach of planning, doing, evaluating, and adjusting as needed based on the data that become available over time. And these are the monitoring recommendations from the study. So the study recommends to collect extraction data from all wells within the deep aquifers. The study recommends to monitor 82 wells, including 4 recently drilled monitoring wells, 5 existing production wells, and then filling 7 identified data gaps, which we will get to in a later slide. And the study recommends to sample an additional 16 wells to bring the total number of wells monitored to 66 for water quality. This is that map, as I mentioned. There are some identified groundwater elevation data gaps circled here in red. There is one of the red circles. I hope you can see it has a slightly thicker line there at the coast. If this data gap were addressed first, this particular data gap could also be used to watch for lateral seawater intrusion. So it served a double purpose. But the main purpose of a lot of these data gaps are to monitor for groundwater elevation. These are additional monitoring and assessment options. There's the option to conduct induction logging, which would help to detect chloride increases in key wells, particularly along the coast. There's the option to conduct additional isotope sampling to further assess the relationship with adjacent or overlying aquifers. And then, of course, the option to conduct periodic assessments, evaluating trends and changes every 5 years. So these are additional monitoring pathways to have more data and more of an understanding of the deep aquifers over time. So back to one of the slides that we started with here. This was a very robust study, and the study did develop a definition, an extent, and hydrogeologic conceptual model of the deep aquifers. It developed the first water budget for the deep aquifers in its entirety. The study made monitoring recommendations, and the study provided guidance for management based on the scientific findings from the study itself. So at this point, I will stop and take any questions or comments or pass them off to Sarah, depending on what they are.
Thank you for the very lengthy presentation. In the future, I would suggest trying to pare that down. There was areas where I would imagine many of us directors wanted to make questions and comments. And so either stopping between the sections would be very helpful. But Sarah, please, that was very illustrative.
Thank you. Just a couple of closing remarks. We recognize, I want to thank Victoria for her presentation. And we recognize that there will need to be a process for reviewing the study's findings and guidance with the other agencies that have groundwater management authority and all of the interested parties related to the deep aquifers. While the study acknowledges that there's areas of uncertainty and limitations in data and data gaps, there is sufficient data, we believe, to proceed with some management. But that management and monitoring to ensure sustainability must be a deliberative, collaborative, and timely undertaking by all of the agencies with overlapping authority, interested parties, and beneficial users. So we are planning to work with Monterey County Water Resources Agency, Monterey County, and Marina Coast Water District, GSA staff, and other agencies that manage or monitor aspects of the deep aquifers, and we'll be coordinating at a staff level working group to determine what the process looks like going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And we very much appreciate the partnership. It's very, very important. I want to start, before I go to the directors, just a couple items, and maybe this is for Victoria, but where you were talking about ways to, possible ways to reduce seawater intrusion, the downward vertical migration, decreasing pumping, eliminating pumping, those kind of aspects. Where I didn't see was any mention of using desalination or desal fences as other measures, and I was just wondering why that wasn't included in such a study.
Oh, that's a great question. So far, we have not found any evidence of seawater intrusion within the deep aquifers, either through that vertical migration or the lateral flow from the ocean. So at this point, there's no need to mitigate seawater intrusion, as it has not occurred in a way that our data can detect that. In those umbrellas of demand management or increased recharge, using an alternative source of water like desal water could begin potentially to replace some of how some of that water is used. But the study really wanted to focus on just these broader concepts of either decreasing extraction or increasing recharge, and alternative water can be used in either one of those scenarios.
Okay, and that explains it, except for the portion where you would show the slide where it had a well that was perforated in the 400 and then creating migration into the deep aquifer. And to me, that seems like there's where your mitigation of the desal or a desal fence would take place to reduce the seawater intrusion in the 180 and 400. Not to belabor that, also you had mentioned that the Seaside was adjudicated and that in the Seaside Basin, you were showing a graph of injections, and specifically for 2021, and I think it was 2022, is approximately 3,200 acre feet that was injected into the Seaside Basin. Was that correct?
That is correct. And through that program, a lot of the water that is injected into the Santa Margarita sandstone is extracted and used later. So it's actually all kept pretty well within the Seaside sub-basin itself.
Okay, and so where does that water come from?
If I may, so that the aquifer storage and recovery in the Seaside Basin comes from two sources, comes from the Carmel River and then from the Pure Water Monterey project.
And where'd you get the data from?
That would have come from the reporting by the Seaside Water Master. They prepare an annual report to the court as part of the adjudication that tabulates the amount of injection that has occurred.
For both from the Carmel and Pure Water?
Yes.
And the Seaside Water Manager, how does he verify those numbers?
So the Seaside Water Master has a board that it consists of various pumpers in the Seaside Basin that they produce a report to the court each year, and it is prepared by the hydrogeologists that are consultants to the Water Master.
Okay. That would be information, is that information you could provide to us where we could see that detail that you used for your report?
Yes, I'm sure we could find that information.
I would like to see that and see how that's verified and who's providing the verification. Other than that, I'll hand this back to directors. Any questions or comments? I'll start with Ken.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, and thanks everybody that worked on this. It's very informative and sobering. One of the things that I was surprised about, if I'm reading this or understanding this correctly, the net amount of discharge is what, 13 to 17,000 acre feet a year? Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay, so I would have thought that this goes to the capacity. Is there any way to estimate the total capacity using the existing boundaries that you have of that area? It appears that it's not a very plentiful, or it looks like a very small aquifer compared to the 180 and the 400. Is that the way I'm reading that?
If you're talking about the full extent of the aquifers, yes, the deep aquifers does not cover the width of the basin and does not go down the full length of the basin like we might find with the shallower aquifers. Derek might be able to explain it a little bit better.
Thank you, Victoria. Derek Williams. I believe what you're seeing there is there's very little recharge reaching those deep aquifers. So the 13,000 to 17,000 acre feet per year of pumping exceeds that recharge, and that's why we're seeing the water levels drop. It's not that it's small physically, it just doesn't receive the recharge to replenish it.
Thank you.
Other directors, any questions or comments?
Thank you, Amy, for the presentation. Can you give me the definition of modern recharge?
Yeah, that definition of modern recharge, we primarily focused on the presence of tritium as an isotope to understand the relationship between surface water and groundwater. We found no tritium within deep aquifers waters through that isotopic approach. And of course, the study does recommend more isotope studies as potential future studies to further vet that. But this does confirm earlier findings from the USGS, where they dated the age of the water in the deep aquifers, and it was approximately 20 to 30,000 years old. So what our study did with the data collected was to effectively confirm that.
Once again, there we go. Mr. Schettini, I will explain why tritium. It
I know
forms.
that, I know.
Oh, okay. It forms in nuclear bombs, basically.
Exactly.
And so any tritium was formed after 1950, basically. 53, maybe. Yeah.
How many of those isotope tests did you actually take? How many samples were taken, and
Oh, I'd have-
where were the locations of those?
Those are described further in the report. I don't have those exact details now, but it was several, and we worked with a lab out of Santa Cruz that was able to help us with that and determine which of the isotopes was probably the best approach for this level of study at this point in time. I'd have to go back to the appendices, and I would recommend you take a look at the appendices. I don't have that right now.
I'd like to find out where those wells were for those tests. And then also, I'd like to point out our impact to the deep aquifer. And by that, I mean is that our agency put a moratorium in place a number of years ago, which forced the hand of many landowners to preemptively jump the gun and drill wells into the deep aquifer that they otherwise would not have. At the same time, part of that policy was that to drill a well, you had to destroy a well. So as a result, there were wells that were still perfectly good that people had to destroy that were in the 400-foot aquifer that were no longer being used. So that sharp increase in the well construction as well as extractions, I think, is a direct result of our own policies. So we kind of left that out of that, but I think we should make a footnote of that because obviously policies have an impact. So that's the impact of that. So you've got a lot in there regarding definitions. You chose to use aquatards as the defining factor of what you considered to be the deep aquifer or not. Why that? Why not the formation itself? Because if the formation itself, it's called the Santa Margarita for a reason, it's called the Paso Robles for a reason, but yet we stopped it near Gonzales, whereas when we started this study a few months back or whenever it was, the deep aquifer stopped at Gloria Road, amazingly, and I'm glad to see that it was finally expanded, but if that geological formation goes further north, or excuse me, in this case, further south, and it also daylights, I think that's important to know where that formation actually ends and the depths of it to see how much recharge it is. Can you go back to, I think it was the second slide that showed the water levels?
Yes. And just to touch on your question, we would have very much liked to be able to focus on the geologic formation itself. But what we found through the data were that many wells actually spanned the multiple formations, and these formations are not perfectly consistent within the subsurface. So there are certain areas where the Santa Margarita sandstone is more prevalent, and there are areas where the Parizima formation is more prevalent, and there are these somewhat transition zones depending on the geology, and several screens and several of the modern deep aquifers wells span that. So we couldn't isolate the data based on geologic formation. The other thing that we worked with was historical precedents. When these deep aquifers were first drilled into, they were named the 800-foot aquifer, 900-foot aquifer, 1500-foot aquifer, and so forth, following historical naming convention, the 180 and the 400. But as screens grew in size with a lot of these wells, a lot of these waters and a lot of these production zones just became more amalgamated. And so really we had to work with the data and the wells that were available and how they had been installed in the subsurface. But it is a really great question, especially with where these formations are at the surface. But it's really that strong presence of the aquitard that separates it from other waters. I think this is the slide that you had mentioned.
Yeah, so you see in between 1995 and 2000, I mean, that's a substantial increase in water flows. So, I would look at that, and I believe that, that there are some landowners, probably some of them that are actually in the audience now that are on Zoom, they can speak to their levels of their wells going up 20 feet over the last year. I look at this graph, and I just say, there's recharge. That this is not a confined aquifer as being defined by the laymen, and I do see a recharge there. And I don't think this is a result of just lack of pumping. Also, I think it's important to put out there too about the CSIP expansion as a way to decrease the usage of the deep aquifer.
Thank you, Mike. Other directors?
Mr. Chair. I've had meetings with our BMAC committee that Amy's presented over the years, and we have seen recharge in the deep aquifer. And there again, it's similar to your drought years. The water is old. Bob Antle did a study of this 25 years ago and showed how old the water was. He still has a study. It is good information, but I don't think it's perfect information. It's something that can be just used, but there's still a lot of things we don't know. And to come up with rules and regulations on issues that we don't know is ludicrous. And one of those is comparing coastal regions to the Corcoran area or to San Joaquin Valley. That there is no comparison, none. That just doesn't. I've got a family farm in Bakersfield, and we've farmed there for over 65 years. So it's a different scenario than what we have here on the coastal region. Saying that there's no evidence of recharge, I think, is a little outlandish. We just don't know. We don't have enough information. So that's an opinion. And so we got to be careful of how we state certain things. That's.
So how do you explain when we do have water tables going up? I understand the isotopes don't show that. I mean, you guys are scientists, so you're using science. And then we have opinions, but, I'm right in between. So I guess that's my question is, as we see the increase, whatever that is, from 95 to 2000 or whatever, and even the blips when we actually had some water, good water years, how is that explained to whoever?
So, yeah, the chart on the right here that does show that cumulative change in water levels, there are some increases there on the right-hand side. And it's important to note that these data are actually taken from the fall groundwater level survey itself, and that is not entirely representative of the time of the year when there's the most pumping occurring. And so when there's less pumping occurring, of course, there is a bit of rebound within the system. And this is a confined system, and as water is pulled out, there is a bit of expansion of water within the system, and that can register as an increase in groundwater levels. Derek, if you have more that you want to add to that, you might be able to explain it a little bit better than I can.
Thank you. I will start with a clarification. There is inflow into these aquifers. When we talk about recharge, when we were developing the water budget, we gave the word recharge a very specific definition, which is coming from the ground surface into the aquifers. And because they're so deep, there's no recharge that way, but there is inflow from the sides of these aquifers into the aquifers. A lot of what you see here on the increases is because there's a small amount of inflow. When CSIP came online, of course, much of the pumping stopped, at least for a number of years there before new wells started to be put in and pumping started again. So you do see this recovery in the water levels. It's not a complete recovery. We didn't get all the water back that we had taken out, but there is a recovery there. And in more recent years, you do see a small recovery. Part of that is because of the imperfect data, we believe. We've looked at that many ways right now. It's hard to extract a single reason for that, and we have thought about it, but we think part of it is just because of the imperfect data that we have, and maybe as we collect more data in the future, we can get a better picture of what's happening with those water levels.
I think it's important that, you know, the terminology that a hydrologist uses, right, with recharge or a confined aquifer or mining of water, to a layman, to a person that's making policy that is not a hydrologist, they view these things and they hear that and they think about it in those terms and they go, oh, well, this is like a confined water where there is no recharge or inflows either way, right? So we've got to stop the pumping. We've got to stop using this water because once it's gone, and it's never going to fill back up again. And I think it's important that the public knows that that's not quite what we're saying, like you just stated right now.
Thank you, Mike.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
And Mark's going to go next, but I'm going to point the same thing out. You should not be using the word no recharge at all. That is inappropriate terminology for that, because what the public will hear is nothing is going back into it, and that's a false statement. So you need to use a different definition, not recharge, or what you're talking about.
Thank you for that.
No, I'm going to
Mr. Chair,
reiterate.
yeah.
Mark's going to go
Mark
next.
goes first, yes.
I'm going to reiterate, it is extremely important that that word not be used with this study regarding the deep aquifer, because it is so wrong to use wrong terminology, because it will be taken wrong. And I will just say, and I'm sorry to mention it this way, but I feel like it was used specifically so you could say the phrase no recharge. And that to me should never come into the view of a study, right? Don't redefine words where we have them already defined in our local vocabulary and our local use. And so now I'll go to Director.
If I could, I do disagree with you. I think we were very clear with our terminology.
Well,
But I do hear your opinion, and I take it very seriously, and I appreciate your input there. I do very much. Thank you.
And I understand you may think I'm wrong, but I'm not. When we say something is not recharging, it means it's not filling back up. And you just told the director that, oh no, we redefined the word recharge to mean this specific term. That is not what is used by most people in the public. And it is filling back up in a different method, as you explained. So when you tell somebody that aquifer is not recharging, they're going to say no, they're going to think to themselves, no water is going into it. And these are very, very important details, because it will affect every grower. It'll affect the perception that people have on growers and their pumping. And it'll be a negative perception that is falsely created. So words do matter. I'm not doubting the veracity and expertise of your study. It is how you're presenting it. And this is a big deal, because it is not reflective of the information that you're trying to put out there. So again, we can disagree, but I will say you are wrong on this one, and it should be corrected. Mark, I'm sorry.
Under the monitoring recommendations, under extraction, it says collect extraction data from all wells in deep aquifers. What percentage of wells have not been reporting? Did the report identify that?
Yes, I believe there is one domestic well within the deep aquifers extent that has not been included in the reporting. I believe all other wells are agricultural or urban wells and have been reporting, but I think it's just that one that we recommend to include as part of the reporting process.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I do have to take exception to what you said. One of the things, but it brings up a very important point, because we have common usage and then we have scientific usage. We have scientists that are giving us scientific information. If you look at the water chemistry in where that is coming out of the water that is being pumped by these deep wells, it has no tritium in it. Okay, so that means that that water, even if it comes up, is coming from someplace else. And they said sideways. Okay, so the whole point is, what I'm trying to say right now, what I'm hearing from today is, we need to put the brakes, absolutely, you guys are going to love this, put the brakes on any more new wells, but don't do it in the way, as Mike pointed out, that caused this feeding frenzy. We went from 5 wells to 30 wells in 5 years. This costs you guys millions and millions of dollars. There isn't enough of the water in that particular formation for you to exploit. So it sounds like we need to put you guys back in the 400. But when we come to management, and this is where we have the scientists and the stakeholders in the room at the same time, and they're going to come up with these management practices. One of them is that we look at ways that we don't dual perforate, because we already saw that in the seaside, in the intruded area, where the 180 is putting it into the 400. It's coming from the side, as they show, because of the formations. Yes, if you go down to Santa Margarita, that stuff is right on the surface. You can walk on it. It's 900 feet down here. There's geology going on here. So we need to be careful, and I'm not trying to be flippant here. It is not recharge in the way you think it. If you look at the hydrological equation that every single hydrologist learns, you know, there's all the different, there's a precip and evaporation, transpiration, and all that other stuff. It's coming from someplace else, which means it's being extracted. We know that from the chemistry.
Understandable.
So what I'm saying is, what we need to do is get a management strategy in place. What this report says is we've got to really get going on this. We've been hemming and hawing this for years. And we need to be very careful that we don't want to make it worse while we're making it. And we have to work with people because they've made these investments. But we need to, this is a big picture wake up. But please don't do that to somebody that really can't protect themselves. What the scientist is telling you is that is the scientific.
Okay,
and what people think it is different. But what we're talking about, what we talk about recharge is stuff coming from the sky, falling in.
I understand,
and we can
Ken.
manage it. Once it's in the ground, it's doing other things, some of which is very hard for us to conceptualize.
And like I said, I accept the technical portion of it, but please understand, this is a presentation to the public. This isn't a presentation to other scientists who would immediately understand the language. So let me go to Jason now.
I guess maybe and I do agree language matters, especially for all of us lay people that are doing this. And we ask for science because that's our best way to understand everything. So my specific question is, You've stated that it doesn't recharge, it does infill, and that it is, how do we get to the number that is a negative number? How do we know that? Is that through the science of the isotopes and all that, right? Like, so, I mean, right, Derek, your question was, or your statement was that you know there's more water that's been taken out than is coming in. That's to me the crux of this whole deep aquifer.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Smith. And the numbers that you see right now, where we're seeing more water going out than coming in, is from a groundwater model. It's from the best tool we have there. It's substantiated by the groundwater levels going down, although, as you point out, historically, when we've had less pumping, they do go up there. These numbers will be refined as we collect more data. This is the best estimate we have right now, is the best I can say.
Yeah, I mean, Ken, I love your passion, but I
And the
mean.
key term there was estimate. You know, it's what you come up with estimates with the best ability with the information you're given. Recharge in the deep aquifer does happen. The snow melt from the Sierras works its way into the aquifer. So, and Ken, it's just an opinion. You know, Ken?
Nothing is
I don't
coming
know,
from the
Ken,
Sierra
Ken,
going
Ken,
into Salinas. I'm sorry,
Ken.
that's
All right,
unscientific.
that's
I
enough.
can't stand that.
So we're done with this discussion, and we'll now move on.
Directors, we need to get back on track, please. And
so
I
this
do
is
have
what-
staff Amy Woodrow that would like to chime in as well.
Wait.
Hold on.
If I may, thank you. May I make a quick comment, Chair? Just relative to this discussion, I did want to add that in June of 2023, at the Basin Management Advisory Committee, staff brought forward a report in response to some questions we had received about our quarterly conditions report that did show groundwater levels increasing in the deep aquifers. We had a lot of questions about, isn't that recharge? We took a very close look at the correlation between changes in groundwater levels relative to precipitation and relative to groundwater extractions, and found that there really was no match between how groundwater levels in the deep aquifers responded to precipitation. And rather, there was a very close correlation between how groundwater levels responded in relation to pumping. So when we saw seasonal declines in pumping, we saw increases in groundwater levels. When we saw, seasonal increases in precipitation, there was not necessarily an increase in groundwater levels if the pumping stayed the same. So I think there was a very good board report and presentation around that. So if folks are interested, that was in June 2023. I just wanted to bring that forward because we have done some additional analysis that I think is very consistent with some of the conclusions we heard today. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. All right,
If I can just add, again, I appreciate your passion, but at the same time, this is a study that is going to be utilized for policy, and it needs to be correct. And when this study first started, it stopped at Gloria Road. There's no science data for that. They've expanded it now, but there was no science basis for stopping it at Gloria Road. It was political. So we've kind of expanded that to a degree. But if we're going to make policy, we need to make policy with as much sound data as possible, and having a complete, full understanding of that aquifer and the fullest extent of where it is and whether it daylights somewhere along the Salinas River, which would then indicate that there is even recharge from the Salinas River. And these things matter. And just making a definition and saying, well, there's got to be an aquitard there, or we're not considering it to be considered the deep. That doesn't give the full picture of whether there is a recharge or inflow, however we're going to define it. So we need to, these are big dollar amount decisions that are going to have huge impacts on this economy of the valley. It's going to have a huge impact on the people that work in this valley. And the people that are going to get hurt the most are the people that are out there working in the field. Those people are going to get hurt the most. So we need to make these decisions with as much information as possible. And I know this is a work in progress, but we need to expand. We need to expand this thing even more before we do anything with it. Thank you.
And Chair, I just wanted to make clear for the record, Director Scattini was referencing actions this agency took with regard to the moratorium that was put on drilling into the deep aquifers. That was actually the County of Monterey. It was done through an interim ordinance, which is a temporary ordinance under planning and zoning law. So it was separate, and it was for a temporary amount of time in order for a study to be done, which has now happened. So I just wanted to be clear on the record that that's what occurred during that time period.
And I appreciate that clarification. And for the people who put the study together, look, we're going to be hard on this issue. We're going to look at everything because it is so important. It is not to discount your work. Exactly as Jason had mentioned, we look to the scientists to bring us our data. And this data also is providing policy guidance, things that you could see as workable. This is where we're going to have our strong discussions. We're going to have pushback. We're going to have important discussions when it comes to this. And we appreciate the work that you've done. Look, I was hard on you. I know that for a fact. And it's because we all have very strong opinions because we all want the same thing ultimately. Sustainable water forever. That is what we're working towards. So I appreciate it. Veronica, I think you're still on Zoom. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you, Sarah. And I'm sorry, Dennis? Derek. Thank you, Derek. Now I got to go to the public. Is there any member of the public like to speak on this item?
Nice, Nancy Isaacson, and then Christopher Button.
All right, Nancy, you first.
Thank you. I do appreciate the discussion and the presentation, but something that I don't think was mentioned, but the study was also included utilizing the advisory committee, which I think is comprised of about 8 different experts. And the experts anybody could have a participant. The Alliance had someone, the Water Coalition had someone, I think Cal Water had someone. So there were several different hydrologists, experts that did participate in the study, and my understanding is did have input into the study. So it is a scientific study, but it sounds like others, particularly those on the board with perhaps deep aquifer wells, have more information, and it'd really be good to have that second opinion and that information. And I think, could be wrong, but I think there's still an opportunity for others to be part of the technical advisory committee if there are individuals who have an expert that they'd like to have part of it. The more information we have, the better we're going to be able to know what we need to do to manage this together. Thank you.
Thank you. And Christopher? Please go ahead, Christopher.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, Christopher Bunn with the Salinas Basin Water Alliance. Yes, as Nancy said, we sponsored our hydrologist, Bob Abrams, to be on the TAC for this. But as I understand it, talking with him, the study writers did not, they chose to ignore some of his critiques and recommendations for this, which is unfortunate. I have so many questions and comments about this, too many for my 3 minutes, but just a couple. One, the lack of data in the southeastern region of the study is extremely troubling, particularly when there's comments like the fact that there's potential water flowing in from around there, but that is theoretically intercepted by pumping before it reaches the deep. That's almost verbatim from the presentation. And that's a troubling thing to consider because it sounds like pumping south in the valley is affecting potential inflows into the deep. And then I found it intriguing that on page 84 of the actual study, it's section 4.2.2, it shows significant transmission between the 400 and the deep, up to 4,000 acre feet per year. That's a significant amount of water. And, another comment talking about the different models that could have potentially been used for this. You settled on using the seawater intrusion model as the best tool available, but best tool doesn't always equate to the proper tool. So I'm really troubled by this study. I think the data is very insufficient for moving forward to any kind of management. And speaking to management, unless my memory is failing me, in all the discussions of doing this study, when it was first conceived years back when, there was never any discussion that the study itself would contain specifics about management. That we understood that it was just going to be a study, and that afterwards there was going to be a subsequent discussion about management. I do not think we're there. And my last comment is, it's very troubling to contemplate management and pumping reductions when we do not have a second parallel conversation about how are we going to create an alternative water supply. For instance, how are we going to expand CSIP? If you're going to take with one hand, you have to replace with the other hand. If that does not happen, there's going to be a very aggressive pushback on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christopher. Is there anyone else online, Eva?
No hands raised.
And seeing no one in the room, thank you, everyone. We'll close this item. Thank you again for the presentation. We'll now move on to their second presentation, 2A, which was the addendum number 14. We'll hand this to Elise.
There we go.
Good afternoon, Board. Elise Ramirez-Sardin now, presenting on the San Antonio Dam Spillway Replacement Project, and the current phase that we are in is this alternatives analysis report that we've been anticipating for a couple months now. So I will get started. Just a quick overview of the presentation you'll hear today is some quick San Antonio Dam background information that we always go through anytime we discuss one of these facilities. The mandate timeline, and this will be from DSOD and how we got here to this full replacement of the spillway itself. I'll quickly go through the alternatives analysis process that the design team and consultants went through for this process. We'll briefly discuss each alternative evaluated. There are 10 of them. And then get into the findings and evaluation matrix. I'll make a brief mention of the low-level outlet works project and how that's related to this overall replacement, and discuss everybody's favorite topic of funding, and then move on to the timeline and next steps, and then we'll have some time for questions. So as I mentioned, this is kind of your cookie cutter San Antonio Dam slide. Nothing worth mentioning in terms of, but I do want to point out the when we moved to that fair condition assessment in 2019, that was specifically because of the San Antonio Dam spillway replacement necessity. So I just want to highlight that item. Prior to that, we were satisfactory for years until that point. And then regulatory trends, as we know, this facility was built in 1967, so we have quite a bit of dam safety projects that are lined up or that are in need. But the difference with this project is an actual mandate, and this is due to our good friend, the Oroville spillway. So just getting into the spillway replacement timeline specifically, how we got here. This was all triggered by the disaster that occurred at the Oroville spillway back in 2017. Members of the public probably also heard of this. I don't think it was an industry-specific item or topic on the news. You can see some photos there to the right, which is a very scary picture for not only the people downstream, but just as an engineer and anybody interested in anything safety related. So this occurred in 2017, as I mentioned. Immediately after this occurrence, DWR, Division, or Department of Water Resources, Division Safety of Dams, which is the DSOD acronym there, did require all agencies or owners that had a facility with the spillway to provide an immediate condition assessment. The agency contracted with GEI consultants, and we completed our spillway condition assessments for both spillways, Nacimiento and San Antonio, in 2018. So the agency progress since 2018 to 2022 included an extensive, so the report itself came out on what our deficiencies were at both spillways, and it had a list of recommendations. So in that time frame until 2022, the agency worked on some concrete repairs, did some CCTVing or closed circuit television videos of the under drain systems, which was one of the primary failure modes of the Oroville spillway. And then also just did research on our design at San Antonio. In 2022, our team went up to DSOD to provide a presentation on some rehabilitation approaches or some essentially value engineering retrofit type projects that we could come up with to address all of the deficiencies at the facility without doing a full replacement. It's my understanding that that was a no-go, that DSOD gave them the formal mandate that this is going to be a full replacement project. Don't waste your time anymore on these retrofit type approaches. So in September 2023, we contracted with McMillan to perform a probable maximum flood update, which drives the sizing and hydraulics of the spillway itself, and also for the alternatives analysis report that I'll present on today. So the PMF update was completed in January 2023, and the alternatives analysis report will be completed this month. So the alternatives analysis process, it's essentially going through and evaluating each alternative in different ways to see what's feasible, dam safety approaches, operational, and I'll get into all these specifics, but essentially deciding what's the most important factors, and then assigning some criteria weights, going through all of these in depth as a team, and then ultimately evaluating and reviewing the outcomes. So the alternatives evaluated, we didn't start from zero. On the right there, you'll see some types of spillways, none of which are included in our report as the 10, but they were previously reviewed in the Interlake Tunnel project, so we did not have to start from zero. Some of these we already knew DSOD would either not accept or they weren't feasible for some other reason. So that really helped us out that we were able to pick 10 that were gonna work, or we didn't waste our time on some of these selected alternatives to evaluate. The primary portions of the spillway that we evaluated were the control structure itself, which are examples, essentially the headworks of the spillway itself. Those are the examples to the right. So the control structure. The location of the spillway is something we also took a look at. If you've been out there, I think most of you have toured it, but it does sit to the right of the dam embankment itself. So we did look at alternative locations, and then the terminal structure, or how we dissipate that energy down at the base. So first, I'll quickly go through the control structure options that we looked at for the 10 alternatives. To the left, the photo there is San Antonio Dam in 2006. And then to the right, you'll see a gated structure. So the difference with these two control structures, the left, obviously a passive control structure, meaning that the water that goes over the top of the elevation there, the spillway crest, will go over the spillway. And then to the right, you'll see a gated structure example at another dam, but essentially a controlled structure in that you can adjust the flows and such with those gates there. And you can obviously see the complexity difference as well. So the two alignments that we took a look at, the top map there, or aerial topography, is of the existing alignment. You can see it's got a curve to it. It also horizontally has some super elevation at that curve area as well currently. And then the evaluated alternative location, and you can see it best on the bottom there. You can see the existing is on the bottom of that map, and you can see where the new would go, which obviously it goes straight, and it would be not have the curvature to it, so different outfall area. You can see that very immediately as well. And then don't let this intimidate you, but there are two stilling basin options. One would be not with the energy dissipating blocks that you'll see on the type 2. So the type 1, because it doesn't have any energy dissipating blocks like that, it does require a longer chute to dissipate the energy. So it has this longer length, but that's that can be shortened with the type 2 stilling basin there for the terminal structure. So what they do is they essentially are able to shorten and then have those blocks in place. And of course, that means less concrete, less money, all those goodies. So the 10 alternatives evaluated are combinations of those three components: the control structure, the location, and then the stilling basin types. Number one is the do nothing. For all purposes, this needs to be evaluated as part of the project as we move forward. So that would be where we're at today, which nothing would change. We'd decide no go. And then option two would be a retrofit of both the control structure at the top and then the terminal structure, or the flip bucket, which is existing. And it would be on the existing alignment. And I believe we would take out the super elevation as the one portion of that project that would be brand new. For all others, you'll see the new OG in the existing location, and then you'll see the alternating type 1 and type 2 basins. And then 6 through 10, you'll see some gated options, and then the new location. And I hope that's clear. I'm going to keep going here. So the criteria that we evaluated all these varying combinations on were primarily dam safety. The reason we're doing this entire project is because we're being mandated by DSOD. So we want to make sure we're addressing all of our dam safety concerns in this project. Operational impact, that'll come down to O&M. What is our long-term look ahead for this project? Of course, facility maintenance and things like that come up constantly here. So we want to make this as operationally friendly as possible in terms of dollars and ease. Constructability, is this a constructible project? I think that's out of the gate pretty plain and simple. Environmental impact, of course. The design approach, so that's all the nerdy stuff that I enjoy. And then, of course, cost. So each category, I'm going to go through each of those, I think, 6 categories, what the team evaluated or included in the criteria. So there's a very clear definition of what was being evaluated. So dam safety during construction, that's obviously going to be a concern when this construction is going to take across potentially 2 seasons. After construction, flood control, and then, of course, whether or not DSOD will permit this selected alternative. Operational impact, the required maintenance. So look, again, these 2 pictures are pretty self-explanatory. There's a lot more maintenance costs associated with the picture on the right than there are on the left. So that speaks for itself. Constructability, the space available, the access availability, geotechnical considerations. We have a significant amount of data for the existing spillway, right? We constructed this before. We know quite a bit about the subsurface. And believe it or not, moving just a couple feet over, you can get dramatically different geology just in doing so. So there would be additional geotechnical considerations in the new alignment. Of course, construction schedule. We don't want to have this thing open and unavailable for very long because that could affect storage and dam safety. And then grading. Of course, those are some high costs with anytime you start moving dirt, that's a big cost for you. Environmental impact, habitat, water release impact, aesthetics, and some recreation considerations. Design approach, again, probably one of the more complex, but you'll see environmental permitting in some of these because there are quite a few topics that do overlap in these categories. We did make note of that, and they were kind of overlapping, and we did address them, so just a note on there. And then costs, so capital costs, project life, and then life cycle costs. So once we had our categories, we defined clearly what each one meant, and we had our 10 options. We gave each category weights, and you'll see there dam safety at 30%, again, one of our highest priorities. Operational impact and constructability, is this feasible and what is it long-term? And then, of course, design approach and environmental and cost is the next probably biggest item. So the evaluation results, alternative 4, 8, 3, and 7, I tried to summarize what each one of those mean, but these are the resulting scores. The next highest score was like a 66.6, just to give you reference of that separation, but you'll see some of these are very close. The differences in the 10th category, so it's clear to see that the gated structure was not in the top 4. I don't even think it was in the top 5. So it's likely going to be alternative 4, an OG with the existing alignment, but I will mention that we will be taking out the super elevation component to simplify the hydraulics and make sure that we're accurate with our calculations, and a type 2 basin, which means that shorter version with the energy dissipated blocks. So tossing in the factor of the estimated cost, it really becomes apparent that we might have made the best selection there with a difference of about 28 million. I will highlight that these numbers, of course, as every time we mention any kind of dollar, these are estimates. The other bigger thing to mention on these numbers is that this is this was construction costs only. So when we start talking total capital costs, we throw it into this financial model that could be plus or minus 30 to 50%. So just keep that in mind when you do see this 50. If I do throw in that model number of total capital costs, this number becomes 76 to potentially 35. So there's that range that it will sit in. This is construction only. So of course, selected alternative being alternative 4. And then the highlight there at the bottom is that this is where we are today. The report is now complete and ready to submit to DSOD. There could be a lot of changes in the next couple months when we get those comments back. Again, we only know from what we've talked to them about to date what they will or won't accept, and then once they see all of our data and calculations, what they have to say about all of that. So San Antonio low-level outlet works, I made a pretty in-depth presentation on this for the budget a couple months ago, but just to reiterate that this project is related to the spillway because, as I mentioned, when we do replace the spillway in its existing condition, essentially we don't have a spillway. So what that means is that we're either operating at our current conservative level of elevation at San Antonio, and it also means that our only and primary release is the low-level outlet works. So you could see where the importance on making sure that that's all up to speed and good to go is sufficient. We don't have any notification from DSOD that this is something they're gonna require us to do, but we did go visit Anderson Dam back in December or January, where they were required to install this part first. So just a heads up there that this project is related in that regard, and it's estimated to be between $6 to $8 million at the moment. We do have a current grant application for the design portion of all of these items. Haven't heard back as of last week, but hopefully in the next month or so we could get potential design funding there. So the current spillway funding, at the moment, McMillan's contract for the probable maximum flood update and the alternatives analysis report is, was approved in September 2023, and we're here. We've got the report, just making a final couple edits to it, and that's been funded. We recently executed the SB 104 grant. That's the 17 million, I think, has been the number that's been running around. And $3 million has been allocated for the San Antonio Spillway design and environmental permitting, which will be our next step once we hear back from DSOD on whether or not they're on board with our selected alternative. I mentioned the pending application for the low-level outlet works. And then, of course, there's always potential notice of funding opportunities. There's one out there currently for DWR, but it would likely be too low to cover our construction for this project. But at the moment, the takeaway is that our design is covered with that SB 104. Just a reminder that SLO County does pay a percentage of the San Antonio facility maintenance costs, and we have been in talks with them bi-monthly. We check in with them on this project, so just a note there. And
what is that percentage?
It's kind of a complicated formula that is in the agreement we have with SLO County. We could go over it in detail if necessary, but it's not, you can.
So it's not a set,
it's not.
a set
No.
percentage.
It's based off a formula which we could detail for the board at some point.
Okay, yeah, I can get that. And then construction funds, which we're looking at 1.5 years at least out, probably 2, but that is yet to be determined. So timeline and next steps, Board of Supervisors will be next. So next month, we'll be going there. In between, we'll also be going to ResOps this month. And then also in August, SLO County's Water Commission has requested that we present the same presentation there as well. So that'll be August 22nd. We will be submitting all our alternative analysis to DSOD immediately after the Board of Soups. And then hopefully their review timeline has been estimated at 3 months or so. So we're probably looking at like a September response timeframe back from them. And just going back to the overall timeline, we were required originally to address the spillway deficiencies by November 2024. So if we receive our comments sometime September, October back from DSOD, will definitely be, our next step will be to request that extension on that mandate, and we'll have a really solid work plan at that point once we know what our alternative is, all their comments are, and we can get them a better estimate on the timeline we'll be requesting. So then we'll also proceed with final design and environmental permitting. Again, probably a 1.5 to 2 year process, just given their review timelines and the number of projects that they're looking at because of everybody's getting these same type of mandates handed down. So then we'll move into construction, which, as I mentioned, will likely be 2 seasons. And at this time, I'm open to any questions.
Mr. Chair?
Thank you for the presentation. Yeah, Ken?
Yeah, thank you, Elise, for that. I see what you've been doing for the last year. Holy cow. Is it true? So basically, if we're going to use the same, if they approve the option 4, so use the same alignment. So basically, our spillway can already handle the probable maximum flow, right? So there wouldn't be any modification to the spillway like we did at Nacimiento and all that kind of stuff.
This is going to be full removal, full replacement. So because the existing spillway itself has some deficiencies in the underdrains, clogged, it's only got 1 mat of rebar. I mean, some of the wall heights are insufficient for the probable maximum flood. The hydraulics are pretty gnarly because of the curve and the super elevation. So this is a full tear down. They've already tried to do these retrofits to the wall heights and adjust the bridge and all those things they went through pretty extensively, and that's what DSOD said no to. So currently, this is not sufficient. We need to remove all and replace.
But if you increase the orifice, then you would have, then you would have impacts downstream. You've got substantial amounts of ag operations right off property there, right?
So the probable maximum flood, the current amount that needs to pass, we're requesting an update to that. We haven't got approval for it. I think the current estimate is 36,000, and we're requesting lower to 31 or 32. And maybe off by 1,000 or so. So we are trying to reduce it, given we did a much more extensive or a more smaller subbasins to determine that we could do that and make a smaller estimate there on the PMF. So that stuff has all been evaluated.
Okay, so where I'm going with this is we don't want a plunge pool repeat.
Oh,
so
sure.
you're stilling. Obviously, it looked like both of them. I thought there was some material there on the option 1, which we saw already with the diversion facility in Marina. That whole area, the whole stilling basin, has to be all concrete, right? And then it has the thrust blocks, the velocity absorbers, right?
Yeah, I had that. Sorry, I had that up on my screen. I thought I moved it for you, but yes, I think, Eva, if you can put that slide back up.
I think it's 4, or no, maybe it was a 2. I forget.
Oh, I have the control.
Yeah, there it is. Okay, there you go. 9. Okay, so yeah, any of this 1 for 1. We already, the hydrological power of this, particularly with your angle coming out of the spillway. So it's going to be all concrete. It'll all be on agency property?
Correct. With the existing alignment, I believe so. Yeah, I think
Okay.
the evaluated alternative had some right-of-way items to consider.
Yeah, the roads and stuff, obviously, you're going to have
Yeah,
to
but I believe
change
the
that.
existing, I think we're good.
Okay, because they're growing lots of stuff right downstream from there. Okay, thank you.
Other directors? Mark?
I believe it was Kiewit that reconstructed Lake Oroville spillway. And one of the things we need to keep in mind is that I think when we go to choosing a contractor, we need to make sure we have a list of contractors that have experience in this work. Not to bring in a housing contractor or somebody that's paved roads for 20 years. We cannot afford that because this is going to be on a very tight timeline to get this thing constructed. And I'll be one watching that closely, making sure that the contractors we've got are qualified and have the ability. And as I've always said before, I always like the idea of having contractors from the Monterey County be put on a priority list. And I know there's a way we can do that, but that's my choosing, as we're looking at services to be provided with this, professional services, if possible here out of the Monterey, San Benito, Santa Cruz County at least, as well as contractors to be considered to do this work. Thank you.
Thank you. Other directors? Great presentation. All right, so you gave us the timeline, and we'll hear from DSOD, either a thumbs up or do this more work, correct?
Hopefully a thumbs up, but likely comments, right? I mean, it's gonna probably have significant amount of comments for sure. I mean, that's just expected. I think we can safely say that.
So, and then it sounds like you've had a good working relationship with DSOD. I know our agency seems like they have. The deadline is where it's really concerning, so I'm happy we got to this point. But what is your feeling on them extending?
Yeah, I mean, I've been talking to DSOD. He actually reached out and said, are you guys submitting soon? Because they're trying to assess their timelines to make sure that they're responding timely to everybody as well. That's why they are giving us these 3-month, hey, by the way, this is how long it's going to take us. So we are in that close relation. So I think we're good, on good terms there.
Let me go to the public. Is there any member of the public to speak on this item?
No hands raised.
All right, hearing and seeing none, thank you again. We'll now move on to our consent agenda item. Any members want to pull any of the items from consent? Is there any member of the public that can speak on any of the consent agenda items?
No hands raised.
Hearing and seeing none, I'll bring this back to the board for action.
Chair, I'll make a motion to approve.
Second.
First with Matt, second with Mark. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Against? Abstain. Passes unanimously. Thank you. Now move on to our action item. Consider authorizing the general manager enter into amendment number 2 to sub-grant agreement between the Salinas Valley Basin Groundwater Sustainability Agency and our agency. Shauna?
Yes, good afternoon. Shauna Murray, Deputy General Manager, and that is the action today. This original sub-grant agreement did come through the Board of Directors in September of 2022, and amendment number 1 came through in July of 2023. This action was recommended by the Finance Committee at their meeting this month. And this agreement does have a financial impact to agency funding. Overall, there's a reduction of $341,000 of reimbursable funding. So this isn't money we have in our coffers. Everything's through reimbursement. But we are moving things from within the sub-grant agreement to different projects. So there's an increase to our component 2, which is a recycled water project dry scrubber. A decrease to component 3 of $595,000 for implementation funding, and a decrease of $56,000 in component 9, the seawater intrusion feasibility study. And I'll kind of go through those changes through the presentation. This sub-grant agreement covers quite a few different activities across the agency. So some of them are for physical upgrades to our CSIP system. There's outreach, and there's feasibility studies as far as aquifer storage and recovery. And then some of these studies, demand management, compliance reporting, deep aquifer study recommendations, sorry. So really the reason behind why an amendment is needed, really what's driving this is the grant deadline is March of 2025, and there's not a lot of ability to change that grant deadline for this implementation round. And due to the system upgrades at CSIP being delayed due to the modeling efforts, we won't be able to construct a large-scale project to address those issues within the time frame. But we want to maximize this funding for CSIP, and so we found ways to kind of move the funding more into the planning side of it, and so we can fully fund activities that at one point were, before this amendment request would be funded out of agency funds. We can actually put them towards grant eligible funds. We also developed some new activities that would help inform additional improvements going forward. So starting with component 2, the dry chlorine scrubber, this project is fully complete. When we originally estimated the grant funding, I think it was $1.185 million. We did spend a bit more than that, and so the hope is to get this fully funded by a grant instead of using any of the CSIP revenues. And again, the distribution system upgrades, there's been a lot more planning effort that's been needed to get this project going. A lot of extensive data collection. We've talked about remote monitoring units, calibration, and water scheduling, as well as some master planning efforts to help prioritize what needs to be done. And so the goal is to have those efforts funded by the grant. And then reducing the implementation project budget from the A1 piping upgrade and instead using that implementation funding for booster pump station enhancements. This would have a direct reduction in groundwater pumping, and it's something that we can complete between now and March. On component number 5, the feasibility study for aquifer storage and recovery, there has been a focus to see how that project would help CSIP, and so these activities were moved from component 5 to component 3. On component 7, compliance reporting and data expansion, again, this was moving the activities between components and categories. And then component 9, the seawater intrusion extraction barrier, that project has been completed and there's no additional request of the agency, and so that $56,000 would be returned to the GSA for additional studies on their end. So this kind of outlines the amendments. So the first is the current subgrant amounts in that first green column. And Amendment 2 is in the second column. So you can see an additional $310,000 towards that dry scrubber. And then the movement in component 3, moving $867,000 to the planning effort from the implementation effort. And so that was the largest change. The remainder for implementation would be $160,000 for the booster station upgrades. And then the component 7, we're just moving that between categories, and final returning the $56,000 in component 9. So this summarizes the changes. The net difference is a return of $341,000 to the GSA for activities that they'll be able to perform within the grant timeline. So as far as the summary, these ultimately, we need a grant amendment from DWR. So the grant agreement is between DWR and the Salinas Valley Basin GSA. So the grant amendment would reflect these sub-grant amendments that we just went over. The general manager at the Salinas Valley Basin GSA is authorized to make these amendments. This went through their board of directors. DWR has reviewed this subgrant amendment. They had a few requests on deliverables for the booster station enhancements, such as photographs and specifications, things we can easily comply with, so we were amenable to make those changes, but no other changes on the draft proposal, so we anticipate this to go through smoothly, and then it needs to be executed for final approval. So that concludes my presentation. I'm available for questions.
All right, appreciate that, and also finding ways to make it all work and keep the projects moving forward and partnering with our GSA. It's very, very important. Board members? Yeah, Mike?
Thank you, Shauna. I don't know if I heard this or not, but did this go to water quality and ops?
I don't believe this has in this level of detail. I believe we've been talking about it for the last few months at Water Quality and Ops, that we're meeting this deadline's coming up, that the model is behind and we need to move the money. But no, this specifically, this level of detail, I don't believe has been brought to them.
Is it possible for it to go to water quality and ops, or do we need to move on it prior to that?
We do need to move on this very swiftly to allow this to happen and to get that reimbursement. We can definitely notify Water Quality and Ops. They have a meeting this week when we have standing updates, and we can provide the letter and detail and have discussion there this week.
Thank you.
Other directors?
Could it have been presented last month to Water Quality and Ops?
I don't believe we had this level of detail until more recently. The letter's in the packet as far as the date. I don't have that handy. But this,
I guess all I'm stating is stuff like this, I think, is important to Water Quality and Ops. That's what they're, designated to do, and we're sort of bypassing them. And past the point that we'll accept it here, but you're bypassing the stakeholders, I guess is what I'm saying. The stakeholders attend that meeting. The stakeholders don't attend this meeting.
yeah, so this is a governing board. Water Quality and Ops isn't a governing board, and so I appreciate the comments about transparency. We have communicated about it, but this is the decision-making body, and we've tried to be very clear at Water Quality and Ops to participate in our finance committee and our board of directors for public comment, because this is the governing board for decisions such as this.
Okay, well, it's, in the old days, it used to be presented to Water Quality and Ops. That's it.
And I do feel that bringing the update after the fact is totally appropriate. Yeah, I'm fine with that. And this is our decision. Any other questions? Is there any member of the public like to speak on this item?
No hands raised.
Hearing and seeing none, I'll bring this back to the board for action.
Is there any possibility of our board making an action that is predicated on water quality and ops reviewing this and them giving it the green light, and then we kind of rubber stamp it after? Is there?
No, I mean, you're the authority here. You're here representing the agency. Water Quality and Ops is a separate committee that's not even a Brown Act committee. I think it's appropriate for this board to consider this item and make a decision today, and then an update can be made to that other committee. And if stakeholders want to comment, they should come here and make comment.
Well, and let me just add, Mike, all this information, staff knows when it's possible, they're going to provide this information when they can, but when things have to move and it needs to be our decision, it needs to come up to us. They're going to update afterwards, but if they didn't have the information, they don't wait on all the information to come, I understand what you're saying. I think staff knows when possible, they're going to brief the committee on that. But we're not going to send back a decision.
I don't want to send it back, but for future references, no, stakeholders don't have the opportunity to come in here at noontime or 1 o'clock for a board meeting. I'm sorry, it just doesn't meet their timetable. Secondly, it just would have been nice to say, hey, this is coming up to the board of directors, and give them a heads up. I'm not saying they're a regulatory board. It's a subcommittee. That's all Water Quality and Ops is. So.
And I understand now, and then I would just point out that every director had this agenda in front of them at minimum 72 hours before this meeting, that they could have brought that up before to any member of the Water Quality Ops for their head, to give them a heads up. And if they were concerned, that they could have been participating in this meeting. So I just want to be very, very clear. Staff is doing an amazing job for what we have, and they bring items to our attention on necessity, and this is an item that needs to move quickly because of the timelines. And I will reiterate, they understand the importance of that committee. They know that they're dealing with the stakeholders and bring the appropriate information when they can. And if there is an issue, we can have a discussion on that in some future agenda item if we want to provide additional direction.
And I can appreciate all that, and my point to bringing it up is they're much deeper into the weeds on it, so they understand the implications of all the different little nuances and how all those things work within the project itself. And so that's why I was bringing it up. I mean, I understand their position as an actual board. I agree with you. We've had this. They're deeper into the weeds.
And I do want to clarify, I can look back at my notes. I want to say the letter did go out after the last water quality and ops to the committee, but I can verify that. It has been verbally talked about. This has been underway for months, but the details weren't available. And the goal of this is to retain as much money for CSIP as possible. And this is what took some time to be able to find out what we could do and what would be eligible as a groundwater replacement kind of study. And so this hasn't been ignored at Water Quality and Ops. And I'll verify that letter did go out. I want to say it went out after the last meeting, but I can verify that.
Did you want to ask a question? I'm going to make, Mr. Chair, I want to make the motion.
Yes, please.
But I do want to say something. And I want to say, there are 300 empty seats in this room, and there's a Zoom. Since the COVID, it's really kind of changed the dynamic in a way which I don't think is very comfortable. I would like to see the public participate more. And because we are the deliberating body. So anyway, but I really don't quite understand. I can understand people are out there working in the fields and they can't get away. But there are people that are represented for many of the groups, and there certainly could be people participating. They were on previous. I would like to move staff's recommendation, motion.
Second.
Okay. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Jason. Did I go to the public already, Eva? I did? Okay, good. All right, all in favor? Aye. Against? Abstain? Thank you, everyone. Passes unanimously. We have our key information and calendar events before us. Any questions on that? General Manager's Report, item 11.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We'll move through this quickly. Under the personnel item, good news, and a couple weeks ago, we did receive from the County of Monterey a draft compensation philosophy that is unique for the agency, and so we've begun that work in detail. Staff has had the opportunity to review and develop comments, and we have a follow-up meeting with the county's HR towards the end of the month. So I'm cautiously optimistic we'll be able to finalize that soon. Following finalization of that compensation philosophy, then we will embark on final selection of a consultant and the beginning of the compensation and class study to support that philosophy. So some important progress there. With respect to staffing specifically, in June we welcomed 2 interns to the hydrology team, and so they're providing field support for our team. In July, looking forward, we have 1 new hydrologist coming on, which we're excited about. But sadly, we're also saying farewell to an existing hydrologist who took a position up in Sacramento. And so no net gain. But anyways, we wish him well. Upcoming recruitments, maintenance superintendent for dams, is you all, I believe, know we have 1 maintenance superintendent. He is housed here in Salinas, and so the distance makes that challenging. So we want to recruit for that similar position, but focused on the dams. And so our aim is to recruit in the southern part of the valley. We're also looking to backfill the vacancy created by Tam Voss's retirement, so that was an associate hydrologist. And other priority recruitments include the maintenance manager, an associate engineer, a management analyst, and 2 water resource technicians. So currently, of the 50 funded positions that we have 12 vacancies, or we are currently approximately 75% staffed. I'll pause there if there are any questions. On dam safety funding, as Elise mentioned in her presentation, in May we did execute the agreement with the Department of Water Resources to realize the dollars that were authorized last year under SB 104. The actual funding amount, DWR does take their share of that funding, and so the actual dollar amount is $16.1 million. And as Elise had mentioned, a portion of that is tagged for the spillway replacement design and permitting over the next 2 to 3 years, and then the balance is currently assigned to the plunge pool rehabilitation at Nacimiento, which is a series of projects that we intend to undertake there. In the pipeline, there's the 2 applications. Elisa talked about the $1 million application to FEMA for the low-level outlet works. We're waiting to hear on. We also have a $5 million application in front of the Department of Energy for Nacimiento. That original application was rejected. We've appealed that rejection, and so we're working through that appeal process with DOE. With respect to future funding opportunities, we are working with a coalition of other agencies supporting the Dam Safety and Climate Resilience Local Assistance Program that was created by the state last year and initially funded at $100 million per year at the time. And the state, of course, the budget situation was much fatter. The governor and others were noting rightfully the need for dam safety funding as part of this year's budget negotiation process. Those dollars have been proposed to be cut in half when we're talking a $35 billion deficit or whatever it is. $50 million one way or another probably isn't a big game changer. So the coalition continues to advocate for at least preservation of the existing funding level. And then, of course, discussions are underway on the climate change bond. It's been pared back significantly from earlier discussions. Current discussions are somewhere in the $6 to $10 billion range, probably 8-ish. And, the legislature's contemplating something in the $3 to $4 billion range for water projects. Likely, they will be wrapping up their work on the education bond first and setting that level before they look to finalize numbers on the climate bond. But all of this, of course, has to happen before the end of June, so things will move quickly. The county is engaged in these discussions on our behalf, as well as Aqua. And then with respect to the local share funding for any future projects, we're getting to a place where the latest iteration of the historical benefits analysis should be wrapping up here shortly. That's going to give us a basis to begin discussions for future cost allocation methods. We will also be turning our attention to developing alternatives in terms of funding strategies. Do we pursue government loans? Do we pursue bonds? Do we pursue PAYGO? How are we going to help fund the local share of future dam safety projects? And then, of course, in addition to developing our internal strategies and the stakeholder outreach piece, it's also the importance of understanding the county's role. So a lot of work will begin on that in the new fiscal year around the corner. So I'll pause there if there are any questions.
Any questions? Please give me.
Yeah, GEMS expansion, really that's just been about outreach at this point. So we've been meeting with various stakeholders about the draft ordinance and related documents and soliciting input. And our aim is to bring the next iteration of documents for this body at the July meeting. So I'll pause there. Okay, M1 water reconciliation process, probably the most important thing to touch on is the work on the financial audit, which began in the late summer, early fall of last year, is winding down, and we are preparing for presentations to the Board of Supervisors at their July 9th meeting. and then before this body at our July 15th meeting. And presenting will be GPP Analytics, the folks who have performed the audit for the county on our behalf. And so that's upcoming. And then lastly, and I believe Shauna reported on this at the last meeting, but with respect to the hydrodynamic modeling work through the winter, achieved great improvement in the relationship between the transmitted electronic data and the physical metering data out at the CSIP project. And so what we are doing now is taking that data in batches and running it through the model for calibration purposes periodically. So the last data set was submitted last week, so that we can continue to refine both the data itself, but also the model, so we don't find ourselves in the position like we did last year where we got to the end of the irrigation season and, oh gee, garbage in, garbage out. So that work is continuing and is improving well. So happy to report that. I'll pause
Any
there for any questions?
All right, thank you.
Yep.
We'll now move on to committee reports. Start with Resop.
Maybe public comment on GM's remarks, Chair?
Actually, do we need to? I mean, I
would.
will. All right. Does any member of the public want to speak on the GM remarks?
No hands raised.
All right, hearing and seeing none, and thank you, Kelly, for bringing that up. Hearing and seeing none, we'll move on to committee reports. Resop?
Resop, we haven't had our June meeting. That's the end of the month. The May meeting was just talking about reservoir releases and maintenance on the reservoirs. That was it. They talked about Memorial Day weekend, which was a knockout. They made more money in that one Memorial Day weekend than they'd had in a year at San Antonio. So it just shows you what money or water does to make money down there. So that was Resop. Our other Resop meeting's the 27th of June.
Thank you. The Joint Water Resource Board of Soups was canceled. Basin Management?
Canceled.
Okay. Planning, Ken?
Yeah, Mr. Chair. We had a really good discussion about the, we just finished the third year of the strategic plan, and we're going to start thinking about the next strategic plan. And so we had a really good discussion about the next Baker Tilly contract, and we'll talk about that in early June, and I suspect it'll be to this board at the July meeting.
P&A, that'd be you, Mark, right?
The general manager hit on all the items on P&A, but I do have something. I do attend the legislative committee. One of the things, in addition to what the general manager talked about, is that the education and the climate bond are the strongest appealing bonds to the legislatures that will pass, they're saying. So that's good news. And the other thing, too, is that there was an opposed position that the county took. It's AB 2079. It's groundwater extraction, large diameter capacity water well permits. And it's the reason, this give you an idea what it is. The proposed requirements in the bill would mandate ministerial permitting agencies denying all large diameter, high capacity wells within a quarter mile of a well used for supplying domestic water to one or more persons to a community. So unless it's amended, the county has taken an opposed position. That's it.
And if I may, Mr. Chair, that bill did stall in committee last week, so it's essentially dead.
That's good. All right, and then you chaired finance, Matt?
Matt did.
You did.
I was in Texas.
And I had to leave. Oh.
You were there, Mike.
Finance, yeah, oh, that's right.
We just talked about the contracts that we approved in our consent calendar.
Thank you. All right, any members of the public want to speak on any of those updates?
No hands
Hearing and
raised.
seeing none, we'll move on information items in our packet. You have the reservoir storage and release updates. Let's go to Board of Director comments. Start down the farthest. Anyone? Mike, Ken? Ken?
Well, that was a little exciting, that first presentation, and I'll tell you what, I mean, I know that everybody up here knows that we have a lot of respect for each other and that we can disagree. And I hope that we didn't scare the kids out there in the public. But I would say seriously, I think that we've been waiting for that report, and now it's happening. I think we can expect the pace to build up, and I hope that we have a serious outreach and serious community involvement. So I'll leave it at that. And the final thing is I would happily report that Big Sur is opening up. You know, we got one lane down past the Rocky Creek slip. Next week, next week, Paul's Slide will be open. So we're down to 2 slides.
You got a fire, though. Fire just
don't tell me about fire. I didn't look at there's an app for that, and I check it twice a day, and I haven't checked it since I don't even want to know. We're terrified every time a helicopter, in Big Sur comes over. So anyway, but we're opening up. The visitors have returned, and I would say by the end of September, you'll be able to drive to LA. And you should do it this year because there's another winter coming up. But thank you.
All I want to do is get to fight for Big Sur. That's it.
Yeah, I will just add that, I think the dialogue was good because the deeper we went, the more we got questions answered. So I think there's a lot of knowledge up here and fully appreciate the amount of work that's put into those reports and science, and we'll just keep digging in and learning more. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just comment on the presentation. Yes, it was a good presentation, but it's largely going to be decided by the GSA. So I hope people stay involved in what the GSA is doing on that matter. Thanks.
The work, I believe, is starting on the spillway currently. I think they started the repair work.
Yes, on Nacimiento Spillway, yes, that work has begun.
Good. Thank you.
Good meeting. Like I said, we all love Ken. And we love the staff just as much. Staff, good job. Thank you for everything, and keep up the good work. Like I said, it's not a easy job, but it's a necessary job, and that makes everything work well in this valley. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you. One is for our next agenda, for our next meeting. We've had a discussion at the board level regarding fee structures at San Antonio Lake for festivals and these large, I guess festivals is probably the right word. If we could get that brought back to the board for our next meeting to look at one as what was the fee structure that we had approved, 2, ways that we could modify the fee structure if the board was so inclined, and then 3, can we extend that that existing fee structure to Nacimiento as well? All right, and I do agree with what everyone said. We have strong conversations. That's what we're supposed to do. But we're all smiling now, and that's again what we're supposed to do after the votes. So with that, we will adjourn this meeting at 3:25. Thank you, everyone. Bye.